Now started our project, and we've had a little bit of a tour of Xcode. So let's start building our user interface. To build the user interface, we want to go to our main storyboard. And we were messing around with a label there previously. I'm going to get rid of that label so we can start from scratch. Down in the bottom right, I'm going to go through the objects and find myself another label. And I'll drag him onto the storyboard. I'm also going to get a button and drag him onto the storyboard. What we want this application to do is simply say hello when the user clicks the button. Because of course, in development, the first task that any instructor has to do, by law, is to do a hello world. So that's what we're going to be doing. Now I can position these any way I want, just by dragging around and letting them go. And as we talked about, you'll see some guidelines. And I would like to center this on that centering guideline. So I have the label and the button both centered. And when I get the button close to the label, it'll also pop up a little lock to grid, and it will space that for me. You can of course space it any way you want, but this is just their little suggestion. On the button, I can go into the attribute inspector and I can change the text. And now I need to expand that button size a bit and recenter him. And I'm also going to change the text for the label. And we're not going to say hello yet because we want the button click to do that for us. And again, we'll resize the label and center that. And you can see how the overall label size that I've picked is centered. However, the text is left aligned by default. So I can choose the alignment of center, and now the label is centered. On the button, you can see that that alignment is centered by default. So that's just a real simple way of putting together a user interface. And we're going to be going through all of the controls, but this is a start. So now let's give it a run and just see what it looks like. You can see that we have a number of different devices that we can use. We have ineligible devices because I don't have the proper OS target, and that's my actual hardware for my iPad. And then we have a number of different simulators. And we're going to be working primarily off of simulators so you can actually see the applications running. So I'm going to use the iPhone 6 simulator, and I'm just going to press the run button. The first time you run the simulator, it may take some time to come up. So don't be alarmed by that. It's just not really quick. After you do get it up the first time, it works pretty quickly. Now you can see that our application has come up, but there's something a little funny here. Our label and our button are not centered, but we clearly centered them on the guideline in the storyboard. So we'll stop our application and we'll take another look at this storyboard. And you can see the view of this storyboard is actually more of a square format than a phone format. This is where we have the challenge of different resolutions for different devices. But there is a relatively new solution when we're going through storyboards, and that's the idea of constraints. So I'm going to apply some constraints to this storyboard. And I can do this really easily to start by going up to the Editor menu and selecting Resolve Auto Layout Issues and Add Missing Constraints. Right now there aren't any constraints on this layout at all, so we're going to add what Xcode at least thinks are the missing ones. So when I add the constraints, I get a new entry in my scene, and it's a list of constraints. And we can see there's a constraint, and every time I select it, it will show up in the storyboard layout. So we have a constraint as to how far the label is from the top, and a constraint for how far the button is from the bottom. And the one we're really concerned about is the center X dimension equal to the starting center. So that gets the label and the button centered. And then the button center X is equal to the overall layout center X. And you can see this constraint here. So that's going to get our button centered to the form, and then our label is centered to the button. So it will be centered as well. So let's run that and see how that worked. So much better. Now here's another thing that we definitely want to check, and you'll want to check it in all of your applications. We want to check our landscape mode. So we can go up to the hardware menu and choose rotate left. And it rotates the simulator and gets it into landscape mode. Now you'll note I ended up with my label and my button still centered horizontally. So that's great. That's exactly what I wanted. It's really important to test in the simulator and of course on devices in different orientations. Quite often you'll find that what looks great in portrait actually rolls right off the bottom in landscape, or looks silly in landscape because the text boxes are too wide or something like that. So you really need to take a look at different resolutions and different orientations when you're building user interfaces. Constraints are one way of getting those user interfaces to be consistent across different resolutions. And we can use the suggested constraints as a starting point. But you'll find when you build more and more complex user interfaces that you have to massage the constraints. The add missing constraints command that we just used gives us a good starting point. But we can also change those constraints as well. So I have a constraint here, but it has properties. So this constraint says that the label is 62 pixels from the top. I can change that if I want. And I can also put a priority on it if I have a lot of other constraints and maybe some conflict or work with each other. And we can also have different relationships for different items. And these constraints essentially are saying how the different user interface elements relate in position to each other and to the overall view. So when you're building up constraints, you can think about, does my label want to be to the right of my button? Does it want to be on top of the button? How far does it want to be removed? Does it want to be centered? And you can use constraints to get that. So this is how we can lay out our user interfaces. In our next lesson, we're going to actually hook up the code.